can be highly variable. You can sort of roughly expect it to be within what would have been common arms for a soldier. So a sword, typically knives. That's one of the other really interesting angles that you sort of see is how these guys would use their ability to select the weapons as a way to sort of get a one-up on the other guy, to maybe try to pick something he's unfamiliar with, or pick something at the last minute, or sort of skirt the rules a little bit to try to get a little bit of an edge on the opponent.
Welcome back to the Athenium Book Club podcast. You can check out the book club over at atheniumbooks.com. I am Jeremy Ryan Slate, your host. You can find me on X. I am at Jeremy Ryan Slate over there as well. And I'm very excited for the conversation we're going to have today, everybody, because I don't know about you, but I've been feeling a little medieval lately, and I've been very into medieval history. And today's guest is one of the best on X. If you're not following him, he's at Memory Medieval on X. His name is Michael. So, Michael, thanks for hanging out with us today, man.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
So we're going to talk about a really interesting book that I'm interested to dive into, and it's about dueling stories of the 16th century, which I think should be a lot of fun. So I want to start first and foremost, what drew you to the work, and, why specifically did you record an audiobook as well?
So there's kind of two parts.
And if you could tell us a bit about yourself as well, I apologize.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I run a medieval history account. I'm sort of doing all things medieval history. I have my own podcast where I have conversations with enthusiasts and experts. Just finished up one full year of podcasting with that. Interviewed a lot of great PhDs, people with history books, other enthusiasts. And the goal of my project really is just to revitalize an interest and enthusiasm in medieval history. As for Dueling Stories, it's kind of so there's sort of two parts to this. I fell into the book on accident. So my project, the Memory Medieval project, has kind of changed over time. My original vision for the project was sort of a hardcore history style, really long form podcast that was going to be biographical on figures in the medieval period. And I thought, before I spend all this time scripting and doing all this stuff, I should iron out the audio pipeline. I should make sure my mic works. I should make sure I know the software I'm going to use, all this sort of stuff. So that way I'm not sort of doing that on the first episode of the thing. So I started just looking for a book that was maybe kind of similar in the time period, that was out of copyright, so that way I wouldn't have any copyright problems or anything like this. And I happened to just stumble upon this book. The PDF is available online. And so I recorded the audiobook just as like a test project. And that's how I really fell in love with the book. And so I've been really promoting it since, because not just that I think the book is extremely enjoyable, because it is, but I think it's actually a relatively important book for the times that we're in. It really creates a link from us now in the modern period to the medieval period, because the medieval period is very foreign. And so this sort of covers like the very early modern period, the Christian nobility, sort of their culture of honor. And I feel like it's just it also is a book that's in a very different vein than most books that you see recommended online. And let me preface this by saying, I don't have any problem with intellectualism. I read a lot myself. I've been a reader and studier my entire life. And I have, much appreciation for book clubs and reading and learning and all this sort of thing. Let me just preface that at the beginning. But this book is a little bit different, because the lesson of the book isn't like a philosophical lesson. I don't think it's not any sort of, a moral lesson per se. What I feel like the real benefit of the book is that it should inspire you to act, to do something. It should inspire you with some courage. It should inspire you with some visceral reaction. And I think that sort of thing is really important for the time that we're in now. So that's one of the reasons why I'm such a voracious promoter of the book.
Well, and I'm going to apologize to our readers and viewers first as well. I'm great with my Italian pronunciations, but this is a lot of French names. So I most likely will say them like a very uncultured American. And I apologize to those of you out there listening. But I want to start because one of the things we like to talk about on this podcast is not just a work itself, but also the work of the world the author lived in. Because I think that's really important for context and kind of getting a full conceptual understanding of the book. And I guess for those not familiar, could you give us a brief overview of Pierre de Bourdelle, the Seigneur of Brantôme, and who he was? What was his role in 16th century French society? And how did his experience as a courtier and a soldier influence his writing, if at all?
Yeah, Brantôme is a really fascinating figure. I'm just going to refer to him as Brantôme.
Sure.
George
Much easier
Powell
for me to
refers
say.
to him. Yeah. And I also will apologize. I did in the audiobook, if anybody listens to that, I did apologize for any pronunciations off the bat because I too am an American. So, but Brantôme, man, he was really in the upper ends of society. He knew. I can't say I don't think he was necessarily directly attached to the king, but he knew the kings. He was attached. He knew he was attached to important figures who were attached to the various queens. Or at one point, he accompanied Mary, Queen of Scots, to Scotland. He fought in Italy. He fought in Spain, off the islands, some of the islands in the Atlantic. He fought with some very important captains. He fought on the boats with the Order of the Hospitallers at the. He fought with the Relief Army at the Siege of Malta. He also fought on the Catholic side at the Siege of La Rochelle. So he originally sort of received the estate of Brantôme, which has an abbey on it. He was supposed to have sort of a lay career overseeing the abbey, and he just decided early on that that sort of thing wasn't for him, and he was going to be a soldier. And so he ended up being attached to all of these very high up figures and traveling around the world fighting in very important fights, the Siege of Malta and Siege of La Rochelle. So one of the things that's really interesting is that he saw a lot of these developments as it was happening. The wars of religion, all of the chaos that followed Mary, Queen of Scots, sort of the beginning of the age of exploration, and these guys starting to go out into the Atlantic and these various naval fights. And he saw these changes throughout society. He was kind of influenced by Protestant thought, although he remained a Catholic. And he lived a very wild life, traveling around, seeing all these battles, meeting all these guys. And he had a fall from his horse in the very end of the 16th century, which sort of hobbled him, and he retired to his estate and started writing all these books. That's how he ended up getting these books, which are filled with not only stories that he saw, but stories that he heard from other people, which he lets us know in the book. And so a big part of that is that the book really reads as if you're sort of sitting down for story time with your grandpa, because he doesn't really have chapters. He doesn't really break it down into like, this is what I'm going to talk about now. It's sort of, he just starts going like, well, I saw this duel this one time and it was like this, or I heard about this other duel, or that reminds me of this other time. It sort of relates to this duel that we've heard about from history. And that sort of ties into this other duel that I saw from this guy that I met at the Siege of Malta. And so in a way, it's a very easy and very interesting read, because you're sort of just getting a long firsthand account from this guy who was there, met all of these people, knew all of these people, heard all of these stories, saw these various duels, was related to these high nobles, traveled the world. And so it's a very, very rich account of this extremely volatile transitional period between the medieval period and modernity.
So it kind of reminds me of another book in the way it was written, the famous work of A Hobbit's Tale by Bilbo Baggins.
Probably very similar to that, yeah.
But I guess the thing I want to kind of also understand for our readers and viewers is when we look at kind of the Middle Ages, right? There's lots of different time periods in this. There's lots of different changes, technology changes. The Norman world is very different than, let's say, the time of Queen Victoria. So I think when we're looking at kind of this period in time, how do we describe it, or where does it kind of fall in that life cycle of the Middle Ages?
Well, it's at the very end of the Middle Ages. In some ways, I mean, technically, I would say it's the early modern period. It's technically not the Middle Ages at all, or the medieval period. But for me, I feel like there's a lot of in the book where it talks about knightly orders, talks about chivalry, talks about sort of the very tail end of a lot of these very medieval institutions, the Knights Hospitallers.
Mhm.
And so the period, I think, from a historical perspective, is sort of technically defined as ending in 1492 or 1505, or wherever somebody decides is sort of a historical endpoint for it. But things don't just it's not that everything stops. Knights continue on, chivalry continues on, but you definitely can see how through his telling of the book, you're starting to get to the end of this. And he kind of laments this a little bit in the book, where he's sort of lamenting the how people are behaving in ways that sort of lack honor, or obviously dueling is banned at the Council of Trent. And so he's sort of lamenting this end to I guess you might say the legality of dueling. And but he takes a very, I'd say generally he takes a very middle of the road approach to that, but you definitely get a feel in the book about how this is kind of a closing chapter on a particular way of living.
So that's really interesting too. And I guess just so that we can kind of put a bow on this, I know obviously these things are very debated. I listened to a podcast recently that tried to say the Renaissance wasn't a period of time. It was just a bunch of rich people paying for art. But when we say it's the Renaissance that really denotes the ending of this era, is it the changes in fighting habits, or what really, I guess, denotes this kind of end of the medieval world?
I think it just depends who you ask.
Yeah.
Lots of people are going to have a lot of different. I've seen people who said that it ends at the siege of Constantinople in 1453. I've had other people say that it ends 1492 with the beginning of the Age of Exploration. My personal opinion, actually having discovered through this book, the Chevalier Bayard, I'm inclined to say that the medieval period ends with the death of the Chevalier Bayard, who I would say is sort of technically the last knight. That's in 1524. But everyone's going to sort of have a different opinion, really.
Very cool. So I guess then looking at that time period as well. So Brantome lived in a very tumultuous period in French history. We have the wars of religion, multiple reigns of Valois kings. How does this book reflect societal and political changes during this time?
Well, one of the things that he talks about in the book, and you can see illustrated through the stories that he's telling, is how this honor culture through the warriors, the warrior elite in particular, is coming to an end. And he even mentions in the book, like, well, the kings have sort of started banning it, and they've started getting serious about banning it, because why would a king want, if two gentlemen have an issue with each other and they're going to fight to the death, why would the king want to lose one of his very competent subjects? That's sort of his, he's sort of starting to emerge with a materialistic mindset, if you will. So you kind of start to see this transition in the stories that he tells, and even in the way that he talks about it, what I think is a transition from this honorable mindset or
Mhm.
honorable way of being into a more modern materialistic mindset.
So I guess that kind of brings me perfectly to the next thing I want to talk about, and that's the way that combat is portrayed. If we look at it as also sort of a cultural ritual in a lot of ways, and what insights does Brantome provide when looking at the code of honor among French nobility, and how did this differ from kind of earlier periods in history and kind of the earlier chivalric ideals?
So one of the things that Brantome kind of talks about in the book is how dueling has evolved in from prior periods up into his time.
Mm,
And so there's sort of, and one of the things that I would say in reading the book is that you discover that dueling is not a very rigid, specific thing like I thought about it before I read the book. Where you think about it as in like it's got very formal rules. It happens this way every time. It's two guys with swords every time. It's in a particular way. It's a very rigid thing. Dueling is a very it's extremely varied is I guess the way to put it. So it starts off the original dueling in Christendom starts around the year 500 in Burgundy, where I think it's the Duke of Burgundy, or I forget what his official title is because it wasn't technically a dukedom, but the guy who runs Burgundy, he basically sets up the format for judicial duels. And so that's how it started. And for hundreds of years, it was mostly just judicial duels where, sort of as the famous or infamous line in Kingdom of Heaven where the giant German guy says, um, you think he's guilty. I say he's innocent. Let's fight, and God will decide the end of it, or God will decide the truth of it. And then the hospitaller says, my German friend is a close student of the law. It was judicial dueling was a very strict, normal thing that did have a procedure. As we sort of got into the later sort of what is considered the high Middle Ages, we ended up with these chivalric duels, which are sort of a demonstration of your prowess. And then that sort of morphed into the period that Brantôme lived in, which is the height of the honor duel, which is where you have this honor culture and disputes of honor essentially are settled through these duels. And that's when you get into an extreme amount of variety in how the duels took place, because some duels could be sanctioned by kings, and the king could be sitting there and the king could have his baton, which, and there could be very strict rules and all of these things. But especially after dueling is banned at the Council of Trent, there became what Brantôme refers to as the hedgerow duel, which is just like it sounds. Two guys go out into the woods and maybe one guy comes back. So it really spans the whole gamut of possibilities. Having a very formal setup, having the king there, having seconds. Maybe it's just a handful of guys who go out into the woods with their seconds. Maybe it's, there's guys who are talking about challenging each other at midnight out on the little sandy island right outside the harbor, all kinds of things. So, and Brantôme even discusses whether assassination is considered a duel or not. So it's got a huge amount of variety, and the stories he tells are extremely colorful, and they really show a lot of how people back then in a way are really not that different from people today. They're doing all these clever things to, get somebody in a tricky duel or use some sort of tricky weapon or, a tricky way that you use to avoid having a duel with somebody that you shouldn't have a duel with. And it's really a very rich subject.
I could imagine somebody ending up with a rubber sword and being like, well, this isn't quite a fair fight.
There's one where actually, sorry. Technically, what is supposed to happen is if I were to challenge you to a duel and you accept, then technically you set the place and the weapons. So there is one in there where this guy, he's challenged to a duel, and he comes up with this very special sort of glass weapon that you have to use it in a particular way, otherwise the glass breaks. And so he chooses these glass weapons. And now there are rules around weapons supposedly needing to be of like a regular manner. You can't choose something that's goofy, but you can prove how great of a warrior you are by just accepting anything. You just accept any challenge. You just overcome any challenge or obstacle. So the guy just accepts it. Yeah, of course I'll fight with these glass weapons. That's ridiculous. And he immediately fights wrong with the glass weapon, and his thing breaks, and then the other guy just easily runs him through and kills him. So there are situations very similar to that.
And I have to say, by the way, I appreciate the Kingdom of Heaven reference. I know it seems to get a lot of bad rap, but it's one of my favorite movies. And I actually have a box set of the director's cut of that, and also Master and Commander, which is a very big weekend commitment to watch two very long films. I think they come out to be about 4 hours each. But one of the things that Bartome references in the book is the idea of Italian influences on dueling, which we know obviously since they come from the Romans, the Italians are far superior to any other place in Europe at this point in time. But how do cultural differences such as Italians or the Spanish or things like that, how do they apply to dueling, and how does he look at that?
So he does mention it. He doesn't go into too much in depth into like a cultural study, but he does mention different cultures and a little bit how they approach things differently. One of them, an example of this, unfortunately not featuring the Italians, but is between the French and the Spanish, where they had a 10 on 10, I believe it was, duel. And he mentions how the Spanish have a particular strategy that they've sort of honed in Spain and whatever, and they sort of have their own strategy. And the French have their own ideas about how things are. And so this fight between the French and the Spanish was a clash between sort of cultural styles. So he talks about that a little bit, but he doesn't dive into it too much in the book. But he does talk about a lot of anecdotes, but not as much through specific cultural references.
Well, I think it's important to point that out too, because it does affect fighting styles. It affects success, failure. I know if you go back into the ancient world, Philip II, who's the father of Alexander the Great, as he's growing up, he grows up in the city of Thebes, and Thebes is actually very famous for having it's either a group of 100 or 300, but I know they're in pairs. It's called the Sacred Band, and basically it's these pairs of gay lovers that, because they were fighting for the man next to them, literally, they actually fought harder than most other kind of warring bands. So it is really, I know it's an extreme example, but it does show how differences in fighting and techniques and things do matter from one culture to the next.
And another thing that Brantome does mention is how very few duels were fought between men of the same culture. A lot of the duels were actually fought cross-culturally. So that is definitely an aspect that plays into it for sure.
So I guess when we look at it, the book is filled with, you mentioned it's structured in these anecdotes and he kind of wanders a bit in the way he puts it together. Could you share one of your favorite stories? I'm kind of curious to hear what that might look like.
It's hard to pick just one. There's so many. Um, so I'll give you one of my favorites, I guess. I could go through so many. There, I don't want to spoil too many of the duels.
It's like picking children, right?
Yeah, in a way.
My middle child seems to think she's the favorite, though, so I don't know.
Well, we won't spoil anything for her here, but so I don't want to spoil too many of the duels because for somebody who's reading the duels. But what I will tell you, not only does it have great stories of duels, but it has a lot of really interesting anecdotes where he sort of riffs a little bit on courage or honor or these various things. So one of my favorite stories that I think about quite a bit, actually, because this is not how you think about even kings of this time. The kings in the period of the Renaissance, you think about, in particular, Henry VIII as being very decadent, being very passive is maybe not the right way, but you think of them as very decadent figures. You don't think of them as warriors. You don't think of them as being courageous or being bold or being men of action per se. Even though Henry VIII was a particularly accomplished jouster, one of the best, if not the best, in England. But he tells the story of Francis I, the King of France, and this story is about how Francis learns that one of his diplomats at the court is going to assassinate him, and he says, so what did Francis think about this? He didn't worry about it at all. He actually just went about his business as if nothing was going to happen. And then one day, so hunting is a big pastime because it allows sort of the nobles to go out and have a little bit of a social time and sort of, prove their prowess to one another. And it sort of is a little bit of a pre-exercise for war. And so he's out hunting. And then there's this guy, he's some sort of diplomat from Saxony who's there at Francis's court who was planning to assassinate him. And so they're out hunting, and it's just like a total normal day. Francis took his best sword with him, and Francis is just out there hunting with everybody, and he sort of maneuvers to where him and the guy are in the woods by themselves. And Francis says to the guy, I'm going to paraphrase it, paraphrase the conversation that they had, but Francis says to the guy, "Hey, check this out. I brought my best sword with me. What do you think about this?" And he pulls it out of the sheath and says, "Feel the point. Like how sharp is this sword?" And the guy feels the sword and he says, "Wow, that's quite impressive. That's quite a sharp sword." And Francis says, "You know, that's got me thinking. If there was somebody who was going to ever try to do something to me, let's say assassinate me, I would imagine they would be an immense coward if they were to ever say, catch me in the woods by myself, just wandering around, and then they didn't try to assassinate me. They would be quite a coward. Wouldn't you say so?" And then the guy made some comment like, "Yeah, that would be, he'd be quite the coward. Yep, I totally agree." And then Francis says, "All right, well, anything else?" And the guy says, "Nope, wonderful sword." And then they sort of ride off and join the hunting party. And then the guy leaves France and never returns. So, just kind of stories like that. It gives you these sort of pictures, like a world into the elites. It gives you a real robust picture of kind of what these guys were like a little bit, which is one of the real, I think, takeaways of the book.
It's interesting too because I look at Francis the First specifically, and like there's of all the images of him, like he kind of looks to me like this manly man Gaston type of character. You know what I mean? Where I'm kind of like, I just don't know if I would screw with Francis the First.
Yeah, he definitely has a little bit of a burly look to him.
Yeah.
But when you start to you sort of get these, he apparently he had a real martial streak too. He was quite interested in being a fighter, and he was knighted by the Chevalier Bayard, who is heavily featured in the book as well. So there's a lot of things that really tie through where you can really get a little view into these guys from that period.
Well, Brantome talks about duels that range from one-on-one combat, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, to larger skirmishes, including assassinations and things like that. What did the lines kind of look like between what's a duel and what's not a duel? Were they kind of blurred? Like, how would you differentiate?
Well, one of the things that I think is really wonderful about the book is that Brantome, he advocates for his position when he has an opinion, and the translator sort of has a little bit of a cynical view of Brantome. So you hear a little bit of the translators. He takes a couple shots at Brantome throughout the book, but I think Brantome does a really great job of really just telling us the story and letting us decide. So assassinations is a great one. He sort of raises the question, but he doesn't really answer it. And it's sort of, he sort of tells it in such a way that it gives me the impression that they didn't really have an answer for that either. That they sort of were kind of deciding whether that was honorable or not. That there was kind of a discussion about how it wasn't honorable, but then there's also kind of a discussion about how, well, actually maybe it could have been. Maybe it kind of was. Maybe there's sort of a little bit of an edge case for that. And so it's part of I think what is really interesting about going through the book is you encounter this extremely wide range of scenarios and stories and fights. And Brantome sort of just raises the question and he leaves it to us to kind of figure it out.
So let me ask you this. When we look at it, I'm curious, does the definition of what a duel is it also like useful to them as well? Like, hey, I didn't murder the guy, it was a duel. Like, I guess how does kind of that work in the definition of things?
I would say it varies, because and I realize that's not helpful.
Well,
But
I guess the point I'm trying to make is it like more fluid for someone as to be useful at times.
so I think one of the things that's really interesting about exploring this period of history is that we're sort of coming to the end of this honor society, and we're coming into a period where the kings and their administrators have a lot more ability to control things, and ability to enact an edict and have it enforced. And
Mhm.
so we're in sort of a gray area there. And that's one of the things that is really fascinating about it, because it it may be that but let's just use an assassination as an example. It may be that if you were to assassinate somebody, that you may get in trouble with the king. And then it may be there, and he does have a story in there where the king does catch a guy, and he talks about the legal case. Actually, I had forgotten about that, but that's pretty interesting one as well. And so it might be that you get in trouble with the king, but it's also an honorable and an honor society. So it may be that you assassinate somebody, and it's not something the king can be bothered with at this time, but it is something that his brother can be bothered with. And so now you have this other guy coming after you. So saying that it is a duel is not necessarily going to satisfy his brother who's coming after you. So there's a whole sort of gray area that in a lot of ways, all of these situations are really sort of just navigating on the fly, including accepting the duels, the way you propose the duel, whether you're having an official duel or whether you're having it out a mile out in the woods. There's sort of all these situations that all of these guys are really navigating very much on the fly, because dueling at this, to the later part of the book is banned. It's been banned by the Catholic Church. You still have these guys dueling, or dueling is technically banned by the kings, but you also still have guys dueling. So there's a huge gray area in here, which I should also stipulate. There's, I think, the perception that dueling was very wild and you had all these guys sort of killing each other willy nilly. You did have that after it was banned through all of these times. In the earlier period, when it was much more formalized, I get the impression that it was not as crazy as it was once they started banning it. But once it started getting banned, you have the clash between, sort of as I mentioned earlier, this sort of administrative, materialistic culture that is emerging versus this honor culture, which is declining or dying. And so that conflict, you really sort of live that through the book.
Well, I guess if the king's brother came after you at that point, you could be like, "King's brother, I have a solution. I challenge you to a duel."
Well, who you want to challenge to a duel is also a part of the calculus you should do,
Yeah.
I should say.
Well, because you'd have a lot of political repercussions in a case like that too. And I guess when we talk about it, you mentioned how it is a little bit more formalized kind of before its banning. It's, I guess, less of the melee that we think it might be. But I want to talk a little bit about weaponry. What kind of weaponry are these guys using? Are they kind of like things from their era? Are they using things from other time periods? What kind of weaponry would it have looked like?
So that has a lot of variation as well. And although there is technically, in the honor culture of dueling, there's a stipulation that the weapons that should be selected are supposed to be weapons that would be commonly used by a man of honor.
Mm.
That's kind of, I think, technically the legal rule. So there is a bit of legalistic debate as to what exactly is commonly used. There's an incident that he mentions about a particular sword that's chosen for one of the duels, and how there's a debate between the seconds about, like, well, actually, if you think about the Swiss, they're quite a warlike people, and this is the sword that they use. And so then it's like, well, okay, I guess you can't argue with the Swiss. So there is some jockeying around this, but you could think about that generally. I think for most of them, it would have been what weapons were commonly used by soldiers or carried by the warrior elite at that time. So I think typically, as you think of like the side sword or the rapier, those types of things were fairly common. One of the things actually that I believe he mentions is the Corsicans. They're particularly nasty, and I believe they liked to use knives. But then, of course, you end up with some sort of cultural differences where if you end up with a guy who is he is Swiss, and so he's familiar with the sword, he can make the argument that actually this is common. This is a
Mm-hmm.
common sword. And if you had already accepted the duel and everything, you may find yourself having to fight with a Swiss sword that you've never fought with before. So it can be highly variable, but you can sort of roughly expect it to be within what would have been common arms for a soldier. So a sword, typically knives. And that's one of the other really interesting angles that you sort of see is how these guys would use their ability to select the weapons as a way to sort of get a one up on the other guy, to maybe try to pick something he's unfamiliar with, or pick something at the last minute, or sort of you skirt the rules a little bit to try to get a little bit of an edge on the opponent. And so that's one of the things I was sort of referring to when you realize that it wasn't quite as straightforward as like, well, once you challenge somebody to a duel, it's just, you get your normal swords, you go to this place or whatever, and there would be a particular procedure typically to make sure that the weapons and armor and everything was similar on both sides, so the fight would be fair. But if you entered into a duel without a second who could sort of advocate for your rights on your behalf, you can end up in a situation where maybe you're fighting somebody with a hidden breastplate, or fighting somebody who ends up having two weapons or whatnot. So the amount of weapons that you can actually encounter in the duels is quite varied. Although I think typically it would have been within a normal range of what you would think men would fight with.
So you mentioned earlier the idea that dueling is eventually banned. And you mentioned Bartome really laments this idea. So why is dueling banned? How does that change culture? What does Bartome feel about it? And you mentioned that there were, some duels that were still going on. So I guess, what does that whole concept look like?
Well, so I'm actually not quite sure why dueling was banned at the Council of Trent. I have actually been trying for a year now to find a Catholic theologian who will have a podcast episode with me to explain it. Somebody who's familiar with the Council of Trent, who can explain it in greater detail, and so I can really understand it. So I can't give you a Catholic theology answer as to why it was banned. For the Kings, as I alluded to earlier, they're sort of developing a lot more of a materialistic mindset, where for them, having their guys, so it sort of becomes in earlier periods, you exercised the upholding of your own honor through these feats of arms, and you took care of these conflicts that you had with other gentlemen of arms through this process of fighting them to the
Mm-hmm.
death, mostly. Although it doesn't mean that everybody died every time, and you obviously can have mercy on your opponent if you defeat him. But this process is much more of a straightforward thing in the earlier period. Once the Kings become a little bit more materialistic, and I think you're in this period through the Renaissance and the early modern period, you're starting to see a lot more of a reliance on finances. And the Kings are going into debt to all of these various merchants or these various merchant families, and so for them it's starting to become a thing of like, well, why do we want to let our guys fight when we can you know uh, these guys cost money, essentially. I don't want to just have guys fighting each other all the time for, they have an argument or whatever. And so for the Kings, it starts to become more of a materialistic thing. One of the solutions that they sort of have is that the king can kind of adjudicate on points of honor. Essentially, the king can bring these two guys together and say, they have some sort of disagreement where they're going to fight each other, and the king can say, well, you, sir, are an honorable fellow. You have the full amount of honor, and you, sir, are also an honorable fellow. You have the full amount of honor. I declare this situation resolved. Both of you are, full gentlemen, complete with your honor. Now, go kill my enemies, essentially. So they sort of come up with this, the king as the arbiter of honor system. And that sort of bridges the gap between this declining honor society and the more materialistic, mercenary, uh, prolific mercenary society as it sort of becomes, or professionalized army society. And I'm sorry, I just I have young kids and we don't sleep a lot, so I totally just lost where I was going with that.
I'm in a similar boat, so no worries. But I guess if we're looking at for our book club members, if they're looking at, well, how do I approach this book? Is there kind of a certain way to read it, as in like all the way through? Should they pick certain chapters? Are there other companion works they should be reading? Like maybe it makes more sense to have some background on certain areas, or what's the best approach to this book?
This is not fancy, but I think you just read it. I think there's no real chapters, and I don't think you need a lot of you don't. I mean, if you've listened to this far in the podcast, you've probably you probably have enough sort of background information really to dive in. There's no Brantome is really, as I mentioned, he's really like your grandpa telling you these stories, and he's not gonna give you some complicated philosophical problems necessarily. I mean, he does sort of present some paradoxes and some things for you to think about, but I don't think you need a whole lot of background information or anything like that. And the book is not really in chapters, so you can kind of just you could take it at your own speed. You can enjoy the anecdotes. You could sort of go through his musings and sort of his explorations of this honor culture and whatever. And I I don't think there's a whole lot. I don't think there's really a huge amount of prep or any real background information that you need. I think I feel like it's a very straightforward subject and a very straightforward retelling, albeit very rich, very interesting, very exciting, but not overtly difficult or complicated to approach. I don't think.
Well, I have to say that you're one of my favorite follows on X at Memory Medieval, and I am subscribed to you as well. But for people watching, what's next for Memory Medieval, or what can be on the lookout for, or what's coming up for you in the coming year?
Hey, well, thank you. I appreciate that very much. I got a big year coming up. Really, I have my own podcast where I speak with people, and I have a little bit of a reactionary personality. It's just, when people push on me, I that is sort of I have a natural urge to push back. And so I like to post about Richard the Lionheart, and I get a lot of people who have been posting just silly nonsense, which has made me reach out to a lot of experts and other enthusiasts. And so to start off 2026, I'm going to have 6 episodes of the podcast in a row on Richard the Lionheart. Some from enthusiasts like myself, others from critical perspectives, just to really get down to the the meat of the subject, to really find out who Richard was and really analyze his impact and all those sorts of things. As the year sort of goes on, I'm going to be releasing some custom medieval themed playing cards.
Oh,
I'm going
wow.
to try to lead a few curated trips to Europe to go visit some Norman sites. And I just have put together an editorial team to basically create a magazine. It's going to be a digital publication at first, but the idea being to challenge writers to write some conceptual pieces on medieval history to sort of help make the approach into the period and study of it a lot more interesting.
Hmm.
My theory on this is that we already have academic works on history,
Hmm.
and we already have fiction and fantasy, but in the middle there's a lot of room for a philosophical exploration of medieval history, or a psychological exploration of medieval history. So I've put together an editorial team. I'm going to look to raise a little bit of money so we can pay the editors and pay the writers and create this digital publication of more conceptual explorations of medieval history. So I have a really big 2026 coming up, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate your support, and hope everybody just gets more into and excited about medieval history like I am.
Well, I have to ask you as my last question. So, bigger medieval badass for you? My personal favorite, Henry V or Richard the Lionheart?
It's got to be Richard. Sorry, you can't beat Richard. He's in fact, I actually did a stream. In fact, as you know, also
Yeah.
medieval scholar is a big Henry V fan. And I did a stream with Medieval Scholar about a year ago where we ranked in a tier list the greatest warriors of the medieval period. And spoiler, Richard comes out on top. So
Ooh, okay.
Richard is just, I think he's undefeated as a commander. He's basically undefeated as a in any skirmishes and any raids, any sieges. He personally tilts several important sieges and battles through his own feats of arms. And the other thing about Richard that is also quite spectacular is, and especially relative to many other figures who may be great figures, is that we have not only the Christian accounts of Richard chopping people in half, but we have the Muslim accounts of Richard riding up and down Saladin's army, yelling for challengers, and nobody will fight him. So it's one thing to have, the accounts from the people who like him, but to have accounts from people who dislike him, who say that he's the greatest warrior they've ever seen, is, I think, quite significant.
Well, I'll let you have that because the Plantagenets are the best medieval family by far. So at least we're keeping it in the family.
Keep it in the family. There you go. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I appreciate you doing this. For people that want to follow you or want to find out more about what you're doing, how should they do that?
Well, I have Substack, so that's really I'm keeping the Substack as sort of the home for the whole project. If you subscribe for free there, you'll get an email every time something significant comes out, whether that's a podcast. So right now it's typically just the podcast, but any sort of announcement for the cards, the trips, or anything like that, you'll get an email for that. And I put out some regular content also on X. So either on Substack, which is at Memory Medieval, or on X at Memory Medieval. You can follow me on either of those.
Very cool. Well, this has been the Athenium Book Club podcast. You can check us out over at atheniumbooks.com. We have lots of more cool episodes coming up. Working on something on Dostoevsky, which I'm very excited for, one of my favorite writers. So be sure to stay tuned for the next one. And we definitely appreciate Michael hanging out with us today.
Thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure.